If you're looking into getting the A7IV and you're wondering if this camera is the right camera for you, then you have definitely come to the right place. At the start of this video, I am going to give this camera a breakdown, I'm going to review it, and at the end of this video, I am going to give my personal thoughts on this camera, what I like, what I don't like about it. Now, a quick disclaimer, I'm not sponsored, but I did borrow this camera from my school in order to do this review. Alright, so before we go ahead and start, as always, my name is Niclas, and I would really appreciate it if you could smash that like and subscribe button, that would be highly appreciated. And if you're new to this channel, hello and welcome. So I'm gonna start off with the ergonomics of this camera. Now, this camera has a very good feel to it. It has a very good large grip, so you're definitely not gonna be dropping the camera anytime soon. Now, also touching on weight, this camera comes in at 680 grams. This is with the battery. Speaking of the battery, it does have that newer FC100 battery, which is good. It also has many dials and buttons that gives you plenty of room to customize the camera to your likings. For example, the wheel up to the right here is really nice. You can use this wheel to either set your white balance, your ISO, and then at the top here it does have a locking mechanism, so you can just press down to lock so that you don't accidentally turn the wheel. Now, this camera also has a full-sized HDMI, and it also has dual card slots, with one of them supporting CF Express Type A. Now, the LCD screen on this camera is fully articulate, and it does have a touch screen as well, and the resolution on this screen is just over a million dots, and for the EVF, the resolution here is 3.69 million dots. Now, it also has the newer menu system, so if you're coming from the A7 III, this is going to be a huge upgrade. Alright, so moving on, talking about the photography capabilities of this camera. So with this camera, you do get a 33 megapixel sensor, which will give you a lot of room to crop in post. Now, this camera can shoot RAW plus JPEG with 10 frames per second with autofocus without hitting the buffer if you are using a CF Express card. But this is only if you are shooting in uncompressed RAW. Now, if you want to bump up the quality, you can shoot in something called lossless RAW that was brought over from the A1. Lossless RAW, what it does is that it keeps the quality, the same quality as you get with uncompressed RAW, but it keeps the file size much smaller. But the downside here is that you will drop down from that 10 frames per second to around 6 frames per second shooting in this mode. And the same goes here is that you will never hit any sort of buffer if you are shooting with the CF Express card. And that goes with all the modes. You will never hit the buffer if you're using a CF Express card. Now, I was kind of curious, so I did bring out my Kingston V90 card and I did test it to see how it performed compared to the CF Express card. And the results are that with uncompressed RAW, I shot and I got 24 photos before I hit the buffer. With compressed RAW, I got 65 photos before I hit the buffer. Then with lossless compressed RAW, I did not hit the buffer at all. And the same goes with JPEG Extra Fine, did not hit the buffer there either. But with lossless compressed plus JPEG Extra Fine, I only got 20 photos. So the good thing to take away from this is that if you are shooting in lossless compressed RAW, you can actually get away with the V90 without hitting that buffer. Alright, so moving over to video. Now, this camera shoots oversampled 4K, 40 to 10-bit, all the way up from 24 to 30 frames per second without a crop. But it also shoots in 4K 60 frames per second, but that will give you a 1.5 times crop, which is a big crop. So if you're shooting with a 50mm in 4K 60, that will be the same as shooting with a 75mm, basically. Now, this camera does suffer a bit from rolling shutter as well because of that oversampled 4K. But if you are shooting in 4K 60, it's not going to be that noticeable because you are very cropped into the sensor, right? So now, this camera also shoots in S-Log3 and S-Cinetone, and it has an impressive 13 stops of dynamic range as well. This camera also has dual native ISO, the first one being 800 and the second one being 3200, so this is a good low light performer as well, but you will not get those crazy results as you see in the FX3 and the ZV-1, which has a crazy second native ISO of 12,800. So touching on the autofocus as well, it's really good. This goes for most of the Sony cameras. They're known for having really good autofocus, and this camera is no exception. It does have subject detect for animals and for tracking humans. And again, if you're used to the A7 III, this is going to be a huge upgrade from that. And at the same time, you're going to find this autofocus extremely reliable. Now, something I've noticed is that the eye detect for animals is not as good as the eye detect for humans, and the same goes with the newer Sony cameras that has that newer processor with the better autofocus. Now, this camera also does come with in-body image stabilization, which is great, but if you are planning to walk around with the camera recording, you will encounter some shakiness to the footage, but it also records something called gyro data, so if you use a software called Catalyst Browse, you can get really steady footage in post if that's what you're going for. Something else that is great is that this camera does have those newer features that you see in the newer bodies, the breathing compensation and the focus mapping. I've been using the focus mapping a lot lately. I really enjoy it. I think it's a great tool to help you nail that manual focus. And also touching on streaming, this camera is great for streaming. You just plug it in using USB, and then your computer will recognize your camera as a webcam. And for streaming, you can shoot 1080p up to 60 frames per second, but if you want to shoot in 4K, sadly, you can only shoot in 15 frames per second. I don't see why anyone would do that. I have to talk a little bit about overheating as well. I didn't find any issues with this camera in terms of overheating when I had the auto power off set to high. Now, if you are shooting in 4K 60, I think it's worth mentioning that the camera will get fairly hot. And something else that I think is very important that I don't see enough people talk about is that just because the camera does not overheat, that doesn't mean that it's a good thing that the camera gets really hot, because what happens when the camera gets really hot is that the sensor starts to underperform. You're going to see more noise in the shadowy areas, and then you are going to lose out on the dynamic range and stuff like that. So just because the camera does not shut off, it's not a good thing that it does overheat. But usually when you shoot in 4K 60, you usually want to slow down that footage, which means you are most likely going just to shoot in shorter bursts anyways. Unless you like shooting in 4K 60 to replicate that soap opera effect where you get that no motion blur, fluid movements, you don't want to do that. Alright, so what do I think of this camera, and is this camera for you? Well, let's talk about that for a second. So for me personally, I can't really live with that 1.5 times crop, and I'm gonna give you a good explanation of why I don't like it so much, because I lean very heavily into video and I love shooting b-roll and slowing down that footage and speed ramping and stuff like that, and shooting in 60 frames per second is what I need to do in order to do that. So the problem I have here is that, for example, my favorite lens is a Sony G Master 24mm. I really love that look I get from that lens, opening up all the way to 1.4, having that wide angle 24mm that I want. Now, if I were to use that lens on this camera, that whole look will just disappear. I will not get that look. So I do have the ZV-E1, so compared to the ZV-E1, the ZV-1 actually has no crop at all in 4K 60, which is quite unique actually. But so that is the biggest problem I have with this camera. So Sony does have another camera that comes very close to this camera, and that camera is the A7C II. Both of these cameras do offer very similar features. Now, the A7C II is a much smaller body, and you do not get that same quality viewfinder. It does have a viewfinder, but you don't get the same quality as the A7IV. At the same time, you will only get one SD card slot. You will not get that CF Express, and you will not get that full-sized HDMI as well. But here's the thing, all of these features are stuff you kind of need if you are, in my opinion, if you are doing any sort of like professional work, like if you're shooting weddings or you have clients that you need those, you need that reliability, for example, with dual card slots, and you need that full-sized HDMI. Again, in my opinion, these are the things that you kind of need more if you are doing those types of things. Now, if the camera is just for you, for personal use, of you traveling and using it personally for your own stuff, I think the A7C II is absolutely the go-to. At the same time, you also get some newer features. You do get that newer AI processor like that came with the A7R5. You also get better IBIS. You do get some features, as I said, like the auto framing that came with the ZV-1. But you are losing out on those dual card slots. As I said, you are losing out on the full-sized HDMI and some buttons. Let me tell you from personal experience, I've owned the ZV-1 now for almost a year, and I never had any sort of longing for those dual card slots. I've never missed the full-sized HDMI. The only thing that I did wish I had in some certain situations is the viewfinder, and the A7C II does have a viewfinder, even though it's worse than this one. So what I do like about this camera, it is a very true hybrid camera, if you can look away from that 4K 60 crop. And something I really do like about this camera is the fact that it does have 33 megapixels, and the fact that it can shoot in something called Super 35 mode that lets you crop in and use APS-C lenses. Now, because it has 33 megapixels, you won't really suffer too much from those megapixels that you lose when you crop in. So I really think this camera shines in that area. Alright, just to sum up, this is a fantastic camera, and if you're not bothered by that 4K 60 crop, I do highly recommend this camera, but I do think it's worth looking towards the A7C II if you are not doing any sort of professional client work. If the camera is only for you, for traveling and stuff like that, it has a much smaller body. This is just personal, this is what I would have done if I had to choose between the two. I would have gone the A7C II, but you do you. There you have it. Thank you so much for watching. Again, I would really appreciate it if you could smash that like and subscribe button before you leave. Take care, have a good one, and I'll see you guys in my next video.